I would like to, first and foremost, just, I think the rest of the delegation that is here before you are people that you have known for quite some time and interacted with and so on from our side. But there's one exceptional face that you have not seen, and that's in the form of Mr. Alvin Rapier. Mr. Alvin Rapier is the acting secretary for the Civilian Secretariat for Police as of yesterday. So he's actually 1 year old in the organization. Mr. Rapier has got quite a long history of involvement in the public service. He was once involved, he worked with Minister Geraldine Fraser Muleketi at the time when Minister Muleketi was the responsible for setting up of the labor relations unit, so it goes. But since that point up until 2015, he has been in the public service in different sort of capacities with various ministers there. So we have then taken the opportunity to welcome him into the fold of the Minister of Police and specifically the Secretariat. There are key critical issues that we have got to deal with on an immediate basis insofar as the work of the Secretariat is concerned, but also in the light of the issue that we are briefing the Portfolio Committee. It's going to be critical to position and reposition the Secretariat in such a manner that we are ready to effectively deal with the issues arising out of the Farnham Commission's report. Now, the second point on processing is the mere fact that this is our second station. The first station was a cabinet, where we briefed cabinet and, of course, arrived at a position in relation to the very same presentation that we're making. So now we're appearing before the Portfolio Committee. And it is therefore going to be the start of further interactions around the question of the Farnham Commission's recommendations. And there are a series of events and activities that we'll be embarking upon to begin to activate towards the actual processing of a number of these recommendations. Our starting point, the Honourable Chair, Honourable Members, is that the Farnham Commission's report offers an excellent opportunity for us to fully embrace the recommendations of the Commission, but also to use them to drive a broader and profound transformation of the SAPS. Post-1994, there's no opportunity such as this one, for an example, for us to begin to fundamentally deal with the critical issues insofar as the South African Police Service is concerned. And one of the issues that require immediate action on our side is the setting up of an independent panel of experts as recommended by the Farnham Commission. And under it, we will also set up a structure, a transformation task team, which essentially is almost like a technical support sort of team of sorts to the panel of experts, and it would be led by the Deputy Minister. The panel of experts, the independent panel of experts, it will combine your local expertise with international expertise as well. And it would be led by a retired judge. And for this reason, and also just the significance of the issue, we have taken a position that this is essentially a presidential project, much as it will be housed and administered at a ministerial level, within the context of the Minister of Police and so forth. But essentially, it is a ministerial project, and therefore the reporting line would be the panel of experts, the retired judge, the Minister of Police, President, Cabinet, and so on. So that is expected to be the process flow in terms of the lines of accountability and processing. Now, we also do think that it's a very significant step that we are taking in terms of effectively driving a change management program within the South African Police Service, and this requires mobilization right across different sectors. And at an immediate level, you require support from the security cluster, support within cabinet, support across government sectors, support also within the non-governmental organizations sector and so forth, and society at large. And so precisely because if you study the Farnham Commission's report, you realize that at the center of the issue there are issues of transformation, the manner in which we do work and how we need to do work both now and into the future and so on. So it's a critical point. But also, you will see that as and when we continue with this presentation, there are points of emphasis that we think either those issues constitute themselves as dependables of sorts, or even if they are not so much of dependables, but they are critical for us to immediately deal with. Now, for instance, we would have to look at the SABC operating model and the question of the leadership structure, amongst other things. And in so doing, we'll have to focus on some other key positions: corporate services, finance, information technology, communication, and of course the issue of provincial management structures as well. So it's going to be critical that on an immediate basis, as and when we are rolling out this particular approach, those are the key critical sectors that we should, critical areas that we should actually look at. Now, the Commission recommended that a panel of experts to be appointed needed to be constituted by senior officers of the legal department of the SAPS, senior officers with extensive experience in public order policing, independent experts in public order policing, both local, both local and international, who have experience in dealing with crowds armed with sharp weapons and firearms, as presently prevalent in the South African context. Now, let me just, stress this point. South Africa has got a very unique culture. Very unique. For instance, on average, per year, South Africa experiences no less than 10,000 public protests. They emerge almost all over, and that's the priority of the time, in a sense. Now, and that in itself poses a challenge about the manner in which the policing has got to be conducted in that context, for an example. So that's the one part. But the other one, of course, I'm not aware of any other country in the world where, when people are protesting, they have spears and knobgiris and whatever. Largely that's what you find in the South African situation. And therefore, the question of public order policing in the South African context has got to take into account a number of these particular dimensions, as mentioned in the Farnham Commission's report. And the panel, amongst other things, would have to revise and amend all prescripts relevant to public order policing. It would have to investigate the world's best practices and measures available for use, without resorting to the use of weapons capable of automatic fire, where public order policing methods are inadequate. In public order policing situations, operational decisions must be made by an officer in overall command, with recent and relevant training, skills, and experience in public order policing. All radio communications should be recorded, and the recordings should be preserved. Plans for public order policing operations should identify the means of communication which SAPS members will use to communicate with one another. A protocol should be developed and implemented for communication in large operations, including alternative mechanisms, where the available radio system is such that it will not provide adequate means of communication. So essentially, Honourable Chair, what I've just gone through are the areas that the Farnham Commission recommendations pointed out. The Commission further states that the SAPS should review the adequacy of the training of the members who use specialized equipment such as water cannons and video equipment. All SAPS helicopters should be equipped with functional video cameras. In operations where there is a high likelihood of the use of force, the blend should include the provision of adequate and speedy first aid to those who are injured. The Commission also emphasizes that all police officers should be trained in basic first aid, that there should be a clear protocol which states that SAPS members with first aid training who are at the scene of an incident where first aid is required should administer first aid. Specialist firearm officers should receive additional training in the basic first aid skill needed to deal with gunshot wounds. The Commission adds that the recommendations by the National Planning Commission for the demilitarization and professionalizing of the SAPS should be implemented as a matter of priority. With regards to accountability, where a police operation and its consequences have been controversial, requiring further investigation, the Minister and the National Commissioner should take care when making public statements or addressing members of the South African Police Service. They should not say anything which might have the effect of closing the ranks or discouraging members who are aware of inappropriate actions from disclosing what they know. The standing orders should more clearly require a full audit trail and an adequate recording of police operations. The South African Police Service and its members should accept that they have a duty of public accountability and truth-telling because they exercise force on behalf of all South Africans. The staffing and resourcing of the Independent Police Investigations Directorate should be reviewed to ensure that it is able to carry out its functions effectively. It would also be remembered that far and beyond the recommendations as stated by the Farnham Commission of Inquiry, there was also the issue of further reference. The referral, those issues were that the Commission recommended a full investigation under the direction of the Director of Public Prosecutions in Northwest with a view to ascertaining criminal liability on the part of all members of the South African Police Service who were involved in the incidents at Scene 1 and Scene 2. The second point for referral by the Commission in terms of Section 24, subsection 1 of the NPA Act, for the purposes of the investigation, a team should be appointed headed by a senior state advocate, together with independent experts in the reconstruction of crime scenes, expert ballistic and forensic pathologists, practitioners, and senior investigators from IPID, and any such further experts as may be necessary. I would like just to add briefly just on these 2 points. Work has already started. IPID together with the NPA have started working on this issue in terms of setting up a project to actually follow through on these particular recommendations by the Farnham Commission of Inquiry. Now, the next slide is about, which is actually not that one, it's the one before that. The next slide is basically what we're attempting to do is looking at resource allocation versus service delivery insofar as policing is concerned. Now, for a period of about 10 to 12 years, the budget allocation in the police has been increasing, on average, around about 6% annually and so on. But that exponential sort of increase has not necessarily translated into service delivery per se, or increased service delivery. Let me qualify it that way. And that's one area that requires a specific sort of attention. For an example, Singapore also, amongst other things, they benchmark themselves around this question. And amongst other things, you'll find that almost 56% of the policing budget, insofar as the Singaporean experience is concerned, is yes, personnel. Then, of course, the rest is towards service delivery and so on. And I think the challenge with regards to the South African situation is that 74% of this very same budget, the policing budget, is towards personnel costs. And of course, the rest, is towards, issues of service delivery. And this is a very challenging point, because wherever you go, for instance, we have, in a space of about a year, we have had no less than 80 community engagements in various parts of the country. And this issue comes up quite a lot. The question of resource allocation, the question of whether or not we have sufficient vehicles at police stations, sufficient personnel, and so on. So and then of course you have another disjuncture which is quite a unique experience for South Africa, and that's the question of the urban-rural divide. In most places in rural areas, you do not have police stations. You do not have satellite police stations, and so on. And that's also a point that in community engagements, it's an issue that comes out quite right across and so forth. And therefore, the question here is, how do we begin to undertake an exercise that has got to try and strike somewhat of a relative balance between resource allocation on the one hand and the question of delivery of services and so it goes. So it's a point that we think has got to be prioritized also in approaching this kind of work. And there are 4 key points that would have to factor, for instance, in the question of repositioning the South African Police Service. The one issue is improving the SAPS proximity and accessibility. In other words, that's all about visibility and so on. And this means improving visibility in the community and accessibility of the South African Police Service by any member of the public. You will also see that this very same point dovetails with also infrastructural issues, because question of accessibility is also must also deal with the question of whether or not in a given rural area or locality, for an example, do we have a policing facility there, and so on. That's also about accessibility, as well as visibility and so on. There is also a need to reduce fear caused by crime in the community through increased engagement with the communities and so on. Now, again, and that's why we've been emphasizing this point in the over sort of 80 engagements that we've had with various communities, for an example. The question of societal responsibility and ownership around issues of safety, for an example, taking responsibility around that, but also making sure that the work that we do ourselves from a policing point of view has got to be informed by community concerns, has also to be informed by the extent to which we effectively collaborate and work with various communities in assisting the work of the police, amongst other things. So that's one pillar. I was relating an experience, for instance, around the issue of visibility, that in an area called Esikaleni, I visited the area, it was just simply a social engagement on my part. The interesting thing is that I went in that particular area on a Friday and emerged out of it on a Sunday. And the cluster commander responsible for that area informed me that there was a strange development. And the strange development was such that in that very same weekend, which was the weekend of a month end, for an example, there was only one incident of crime that was reported, and that was a rape case. And that was unusual for them, for an example, to experience something like that. And that was attributed to the mere fact that there was quite a lot of police activity because I seemed to have been around the area and so on, and therefore visibility somewhat became a bit of a deterrent to criminal activity and so on. And now I think there's certainly I think we can learn from such experiences, and I think there can be many others where the issue of visibility becomes central in the deterrence of crime and criminal activity. The second pillar is the question of prevention, investigation, and the repression of crime, which will include the question of implementing measures to prevent individuals or institutions from committing crime, and that's deterrence. Repress, investigate, and resolve crimes quickly and effectively, and ensure that offenders are brought to justice. Now, that in itself, you'll see later on in the presentation, because it's a point that we're also making about the question of the need to effectively coordinate between ourselves as the police on the one hand and prosecution, as well as the point of incarceration and so on. It's a point that has got to be effectively sort of taken up and be seriously somewhat addressed. Now, the third pillar is the question of an integration at the security cluster level. And that means the need, amongst other things, the need to improve our case management system, for an example, between arrest, prosecution, and incarceration. But also one of the things is that you also need to pay adequate attention on the question of an ICT network as an enabling sort of infrastructure, for instance, to enhance the question of effective case management, amongst other things, including the question of improving processes and policies, so that you have the ICT instrument as a critical instrumentation, for instance, in such activation. But also that when we talk of policing in South Africa, we're talking about essentially a single function. And therefore there is a need to begin to invest in the direction of integrating the work of the SAPS and Metro police officers. Now, the fourth critical area that we need to focus on in repositioning our work is coordination of international work. And that essentially means that we need to cooperate with local and international stakeholders in addressing issues of crime prevention and measures that would have to be embarked upon. And on this front, for an example, just to make an example, the question of drug trafficking, whether it's in the Western Cape or anywhere in the country or in Johannesburg and so forth, you can't deal with that issue unless you understand the effectively the dynamic of the international drug networks, including question of human trafficking and so on. And understanding the modus operandi per se, and the countries involved up until to where we are as South Africa in terms of being recipients, for an example, of illicit drugs and so on. So, but if that's what we need to do, it means we need to be much more sharper insofar as the issue of intelligence gathering, for an example, and exchange of intelligence work and information between ourselves and other agencies located in other countries, amongst other things, and that also foster issues of cooperation between ourselves and relevant countries around issues of crisis management, but also sharing best practices. There are countries in the world, for instance, around the issues of a fight against drugs and human trafficking, for an example, that have got quite an experience and that have invested quite a lot, for an example, in investigating but also understanding the international sort of dynamic insofar as the issue of drug trafficking. So I'm just making an example about that, but basically the point here is that we do need to integrate our work but also coordinate effectively with the international agencies and various sort of countries. Now, there are key implications. He's not listening, I'm sure. The key implications that would require points of attention as raised by the Farnham Commission for the SAPS to focus on. There are basically 5 broad areas that would have to be looked into. The first one is, of course, the question of the organizational structure and culture of the SAPS, which in this instance, there is a need to look at the question of the leadership fit. I think at some point before this portfolio comment, I was once asked the question of whether or not do I think that we have the right people in the right sort of places and so forth, and so far as management is concerned and so on. Now, any responsible organization on a continuous basis, from time to time, it will go back to begin to interrogate this question. In what we are doing, do we still have the relevant people to execute what should be done? Now, and this means competencies and skills assessment, amongst other things, and particularly when it comes to commissioned officers. The question of the organization structure. Now, the organizational structure, I think also, if I'm not mistaken, even here in Parliament, this question was even posed, around the question of specialized units, for an example. And in all, I don't recall a community meeting wherein I've not been asked this question about the revival, for an example, of specialized units in dealing with specific crimes. So, at a community level, and broadly speaking across our society, there is quite an issue around the issue of the revival of specialized units and so forth. We'll also need to look at the question of values and codes and the code of ethics as well as code of conduct and so on and so on. But key to all these things that I've just spoken about is the question of performance management and consequent management. And that's all about accountability, really, in a sense. The second area is the question of operating principles and procedures, which essentially is about intelligence planning and coordination, tactical operations decisions, command and control, issues of communication protocol, engagement rules, and the use of force. Now, you remember that both constitutionally and also the point emphasized by the Farnham Commission is that as the police, we exercise violence on behalf of South Africans, or we use force on behalf of South Africans. Now, and therefore it has, even that area too, is an area that has got to be effectively governed, taking into account the human rights culture and the constitutionality of the society that we have. and so on. And therefore, the issues of line and distance management, for instance, in managing public order situations becomes important. The question of negotiations and negotiation skills, also an important area that constitutes engagement rules. Question of arrest procedures, physical, mechanical, and deadly force, and so forth. So those matters are matters that must also be looked into. The third area is around equipment and infrastructure. Now, we need to invest in that direction, and most countries have also done so, investing in the direction of alternative methods of enforcement of law enforcement, for an example. Now, but that talks to the issue of the kind of equipment such as gears, weapons, and others that we need to look into. And I must also state that, interestingly, some countries, including I think countries like Italy, for an example, has moved in the direction of inventing even technology in the use of equipment. For an example, for instance, I'm told that they are now exploring the setting up of a command center, which I think they have. But also linked to that is that if you draw your weapon, that immediately registers at the command center, for an example. And therefore those that are seated at the command center and responsible for the command center are able to take an effective decision about what kind of reinforcement and deployment would then be required to assist you as a police officer on the ground facing such kind of a situation and so forth. So these are some of the interesting sort of technological developments, including the kind of weapons that now are mounted with cameras, for an example, which captures almost on the spot the happenings on a crime scene, but that would get relayed back to the command center, so that you clearly have answers about what is it that would have transpired in a given sort of environment or given situation, for that matter, and so on. So these are interesting sort of technological developments insofar as issues of equipment and infrastructure that is beginning to emerge in other parts of the world. Now, the question of training and learning is the fourth point of emphasis that we need to look into. The question of mandatory periodic training programs. I'm not sure what the situation is in the army today, but I'm aware that way back in the military, you would usually have periodic sort of training of members and so on, both at the physical combat, your use of weaponry, which is basically your tactic, physical kind of focal points, policies and procedures, the issues of teamwork, self-control, but also understanding the human rights environment within which we have got to operate. I once asked an officer who had just emerged out of our training college. So I asked, look, I've never trained as a police officer, for example, but what are you being trained on? So she said all sorts of manner of things and so on. And one thing that was not stated is the question of how to police within the human rights context and understanding the Constitution, for an example. Now, which means that it is an area that has got to be somewhat captured and be logged on in terms of the kind, form, and I think character of the kind of training also must begin to log on this particular issue, in a sense that at a practical level, if you are trained as a police officer, you must also understand that you are to police in the best interest of the South African public, and you are to police within the human rights context, and the police within the constitutional context, and so forth. So it becomes an important area that we have got to look into. At the legislative and regulatory framework level, there are two critical areas that have got to be looked into. Is the question of demilitarization and the question of professionalization. Now, the panel of experts will also have got to cover this broad spectrum of issues, but also in specific terms, there is this work and research work that has got to be done around the question of demilitarization, professionalization, and so on of the South African Police Service. And that's why we think that the manner in which the panel is going to be constituted, the local and the international sort of experts, it's going to assist us to tap into the reservoir of knowledge, experience, and best practices in the world around issues of demilitarization and professionalization of the police service. Now, this slide talks about he's also sleeping. Now, you're not listening. Yeah. The fourth, this is what we call a house, but basically it sums up the question of the four pillars as I had spoken to and about earlier on. But the area that I want to emphasize on this slide is the question of the key enablers. For instance, all the four pillars as identified, if we are to succeed, we must then deal with the question of culture and people in the organization. We must also deal with the question of the organizational structure. We must also deal with the question of the operating principles, skills, training, and professionalization. We must also deal with the issues of ICT infrastructure and equipment as part of the set of enablers. We must deal with the issues of funding. We need to, if all of this is to take root and it has got to roll out and take effective implementation and execution thereof, you require these particular enablers. Legislation, policy, and regulation, there are areas where we may need to revisit maybe legislation, but other areas around policy and regulations. For instance, in the Farnham Commission's report, I think chapter 25, for an example, page 500 and some odd number, talks about the specific areas of operating procedures, for an example, that would have to be looked into, be reviewed, and so forth, as part of the work that would have to be done at the level of the panel of experts. The next slide is about the independent panel of experts, which of course is to be led by a judge appointed by the President, and that the reporting line shall be the Minister to the President and Cabinet, and the international experts on public order policing, and the emphasis here would be on countries that share more or less a similar experience with the South African experience insofar as issues of public order policing and the best practice in the use of non-lethal methods and so on. But certainly in this country we have a number of local experts. For instance, we have experts in this country, that are located in the academia, for an example, Chair, people that can also make an effective contribution. So we need to look at how we pull them in. We also have people that have written quite extensively about issues of policing and or criminology, generally speaking, and so forth. The question will be, how do we pull them into the fold and so on? And then, of course, you have got practitioners in the field of policing. I mean, if you were to engage with various sort of practitioners in the field of policing and people that have evolved with the policing issue over a period of time, for instance, there's a wealth of experience that we can unearth at that level. And then, of course, the question of the senior officers with the relevant experience and high integrity within the sort of police service, and senior officers from the SAPS legal department and the secretariat. And of course, the mandate will be to revise and amend all prescripts relevant and relating to public order policing, investigate the world's best practices and measures available for use without resorting to the use of weapons capable of automatic fire, and where public order policing methods are inadequate. So this is generally what the panel of experts is going to look like and so on. And then under this panel, you then have a transformation task team, which will be led by the Deputy Minister of Police. And by composition, it will also have the National Commissioner, the international and local experts, and selected senior officers of the South African Police Service will also be constituted into this task team. But basically, this task team, as I said, it's much more of, a technical support structure in a sense. And it's it will. This is where, for instance, the program management office will be housed, amongst other things, in driving the overall change management program, amongst other things. This is where you also need to have quite an effective research capability located in there to look into a number of these identified areas and so on. It will also be expected that this particular task team would have to formulate proposals regarding the other aspects of transformation in the SAPS, such as organization and culture change, professionalization, ICT, issues of big data and funding issues, and so on. Receiving and integrating recommendations from the independent panel of experts, preparing an integrated plan for SAPS transformation, and the creation of a results delivery office. Now, the results delivery office is the same thing as your program management office. Now, if we're to look at how it will then, the next slide, please. If you look at how again here on the question of the transformation task team, what we're trying to do here is to break the whole thing down, regardless of on the left, of course, is the question of the line of command in terms of reporting lines and so on. It's all right, but the three blocks on the right hand side, we are then beginning to factor in what, for instance, the results delivery office would actually look like. For instance, you need a team leader with 4 to 5 experts in there, one per major area of transformation and so forth. You also need to have weekly updates to the task team leader, which in this instance would be the deputy minister and so forth. Support designs design the initial overall transformation program, support the critical program trade-off decisions and cross-functional roadblocks and so forth, ensure resourcing and funding, apply consequence management, provide common framework and simple tools for risk assessment, sponsorship, tracking, reporting, and progress generally. Now, precisely because it's a change management program, you need to also factor in a reviewal process on an ongoing basis. Once you have a change management plans and programs in place, there will also be a need to take stock of how and what the experience would be on the ground. At the senior management of the SAPS, you require 5 members, which will, in this case, be the National Commissioner, maybe 2 provincial commissioners and senior management and so on in identified areas and so forth. Now, those of you who may have been involved with issues of change management and or transformation in any institution would know that you require a combination of 2 approaches, generally speaking. The one approach is a fresh look from outside in, but the other one is in terms of people who have, an organizational based sort of experience. What is this institution? So you require an as-is element also into it. Because if your change management program does not accommodate the 2 and does not entail the 2, basically, you are likely to fail actually big time when it comes to that. Now, insofar as the question of experts and or advisors, we are looking at 3 to 5 members, both at local and international, and with a specific focus on public order policing and syndicate crime and so forth. And they would assist in providing benchmarks and best practices in each technical area of transformation. They would have to contribute to the analysis of the status quo and to the critical problem solving, and support the transformation program definition. So it's a change management program. It's essentially a moving program. So you design your plans, you implement your plans, you execute your plans, but also the experience at the level of the execution of your plans is what you use in feeding back what your next step or future perspectives should actually be like. So it's an evolving sort of a program in a sense. So those are the issues. Now, the question is, what happens in the next 24 months? And we are saying there are 3 main areas, for an example, that would have to be focused on as imperatives. The stage we are in now, actually, is that we would have to focus on the question of the implementation of the Farnham Commission's recommendations. So that's what the period is and so on. But also, the question of micro-criminality has got to be tackled. For instance, you remember that we spoke about 4 critical areas of importance that we should actually be dealing with, regardless. We don't need to wait for a change management program per se for us to be able to do those things, issues of accessibility, visibility, repression of crime and so on. And that's the category around the issue of micro-criminality and so forth. Question with a specific focus on the issues of hijacking, robberies and so on. And the question of syndicates as well, which is your issues of customs and border management matters, as well as drug trafficking and human trafficking. It will be there. And on the left, what you then have is that the cross-cutting issues across the 3 imperatives is the question of culture and people, organization structure, operating principles and training, ICT infrastructure and equipment, funding, legislation, policy, and regulation as well. Now, the next slide is about the structure and its leadership that would have to be subject to a review and assessment process. I'm not going to deal much with this because I think in the beginning I dealt with the issue of what are the key critical areas that would have to be looked into insofar as the question of structure and leadership fit the issues of competencies and the rest that we had spoken about earlier on. There are also issues that we also define as the moments of truth. In other words, things that would need to look at emphasizing on, particularly in relation to the key critical areas that we had also spoken about earlier on. And that's the question, for instance, the issue of police officers on patrol, and that's about, again, the issue of visibility and so forth. And the point that we're making there is that there is also a need to emphasize on treating members of the public and colleagues with respect and courtesy, and making sure that there is no abuse of power and or authority, demonstrate vigilance from time to time. And so the second area, of course, is police officers involved in an intervention. In other words, again, if we intervene in situations, be it public order policing kind of situations, again, the same principles have got to apply, treating people with respect and courtesy, being sensitive to victims' emotional stress, making sure that we do not abuse power and authority, and using restraint when necessary and in proportion to the situation, diligently carrying out our work as well as being responsible. The third area, members of the public, visiting our service delivery points, such as police stations, for an example, the same principles also apply there. A question of members of the public visiting police stations, similar sort of principles also are applicable. Now, the next slide is about basically the question of how do we begin to. It's also about resource allocation and prioritizing, basically, our resources in a sense. Now, we will also just throw in some examples. For an example, 27% of all crime takes place in Gauteng. So that must say something about the manner in which we then have got to deploy resources in that regard. But even in Gauteng itself, you would find situations such as the theft of motor vehicles and motorcycles being the highest in Brooklyn in Pretoria. So that tells you that the manner in which we have got to deal with practical circumstances of this nature, and the manner in which we deploy resources also becomes critical to be informed by such realities. Property-related crime, commercial crime, and aggravated robbery is also the highest in Gauteng, and so on. Now, but if you were to take that and contrast it against KZN, with 16.9% of all crime taking place in KZN, it becomes actually the third highest. But also the largest contributing factor there are contact crimes, highest in that province. Possibly at every slightest sort of provocation, or if we disagree, things like that. It's possibly one of those factors. 42.9% basically of murders take place in both KZN and Eastern Cape. So that also tells a story about the kind of challenges there. Now, so what all we're trying to say in this particular slide is that, you know, the question of crime type and occurrence should also determine the question of location of your specialized units and or deployment of resources, for an example. And that in dealing with these issues, you also require collaboration with local communities is being part of the critical element of the change management program. Now, the next slide is about the question of an integrated ICT system as an important component of transformation. There are generally 2 points about this. The one general point is that the question of ICT is what that's how the world moves today. So in a sense, we also need to fit into that in sharpening our methods when it comes to issues of policing and as well as dealing with issues of criminality in our society. So basically, this is a cycle that informs that informs the question of coordination and integration between policing, prosecution, and incarceration. And in it, you require to make sure that at the level of reporting and investigation, of course, ICT is factored, but also at the level of prosecution, particularly the issue of case management system, as I had spoken about earlier on, ICT has got to be factored and so on. Let me just give you an example. You know, in recent times, there is Operation Fiela. Now, I remember being asked this question. The people that had been arrested, for instance, how many of them had been effectively prosecuted and convicted? Now, for you to be able to give an effective answer on that question, you can only do so as and when you, at the press and click of a button, using an ICT enabling sort of instrument, that information just has got to come up, you know, that sort of thing. So these are some of the things, and I'm quite happy that even within the JCPS cluster, where this matter is also receiving attention, to look at improving our methods using ICT around case management system and so forth. But that, all of it, arrest, prosecution, all of it, the landing point is, of course, incarceration and so forth. And that itself is this kind of cycle that has got to be looked into. Now, at the bottom of this slide, we are also talking about the supporting infrastructures as essentially, an enabler to ensure that we are able to use ICT and position ICT and positioning of ICT at the center of the work that we do on a day-to-day basis. Now, the next slide is just an illustration of, and I'm not going to be at liberty to talk much about this slide per se, except just to say that there's a need to increase investigation speed at the level of investigations, but also efficiency and reducing repeat sort of offenders, recidivism, basically. But if we are to do that, again, the question of ICT being at the center of that, in in the late 80s, beginning of the 90s. That was a very intense period of violence, for an example, in KZN. And there was, we became aware about how some of these things continued to happen, basically. Some of these hits would be organized within prison cells, for an example. And today, one of the challenges in our prison facilities is the question of, access to things such as cell phones. And there is also a need to essentially begin to look into how these networks operate once, they're in there. For instance, I'm sure here in the Western Cape is the same kind of experience in terms of, the gang wars as you find them at a community level, are the same gang formations that you'll find between, behind the prison walls and so on. Now, and the question of these networks, for one to establish them, you require an effective sort of ICT mechanism and intervention at that level. So basically, this is just simply, trying to illustrate how this. We remember that how this sort of system works, but also remember that the point of emphasis on this slide is repeat offenders, recidivism, basically, in a sense, how people are incarcerated from our communities into a prison system, but also continue, to influence and inform what has got to happen, or continues to happen at a community level. Even when they get released into an established and existing system of sorts. So, question of the ICT intervention at that level in monitoring all these particular trends is going to be essential, because we can't talk about crime prevention without looking into this particular angle as well. The next slide is just simply the kind of equipment. For instance, you remember, Chair, that earlier on in the beginning of this presentation, I spoke about what are the developing trends in the world today insofar as alternative weaponry, gear, and everything else and so on. For instance, the firearms as you see them on the screen on the left, they are very serious looking, but they don't kill. That's non-lethal kind of weaponry, for an example. Some of it works like, what do you call this thing in the game farms, man? Is it tranquilizers? Tranquilizers. Something that I would take a very good shot at Mr. Kroneval there, and all he does is to flop off. To be nice. Apologies, I don't know why I picked up on you, but nevertheless, I'm just making an example. Something like that. And of course, acoustic sort of equipment in crowd management situations. You have devices that you can actually deploy and disorganize a crowd, for an example. Irritate and whatever and so forth. Those are the whole range of things that we need to begin to look at. Slide number 20, I'm not going to show because it's still subject to ongoing work. But basically what we're attempting to do is that the question arises, if this is the approach that we're taking, you require resources to deal with the whole range of these particular matters. And our thinking is simply nothing else that actually would require almost 1% of our existing budget to be reprioritized to to enable this kind of work. But we're also clear that in case we explore that area and, of course, we're unable to get it right and so forth, we'll also activate National Treasury on this question, because it's a special project arising out of the Commission of Inquiry exercise. Now, the rest of the slides really, Chairperson, is more to do with just the terms of reference for the panel of experts. I think it's about 3-4 pages of such, and I would not want to take much of your time really going through the terms of reference in terms of this. Of importance is the question of what approach are we taking in dealing with the Farnham Commission's recommend the commission's inquiry and its recommendations. Thank you very much, Chairperson.
Thank you, Minister of Police. I didn't indicate who are the members. I'll start here in the next round from that side. If we can restrict you to two questions or comments for the first round, and then we come back, starting again with Mr. Groenewald. Honourable Mulabatsi. Yeah, Minister, I think from the committee side we welcome the presentation, because in effect it's a state of the police address, in effect, to say, well, this is the issues, we must address it. I think we also welcome the fact that it's a presidential project and also in effect a ministerial project. I think one important issue I just want to maybe get your comments on, because you've mentioned the issue of transformation and leadership. You also specifically indicated the SABC structure, corporate governance, CFO, provincial structure. Our observation as a committee during this last 6 to 8 weeks, clearly there needs to be change, there needs to be new leadership in driving this project from the task team that's going to be handled by the Deputy Minister. Will that composition also take cognizance of the need to inject some new leadership? Because any change project is dependent on all role players on board. For instance, we've seen this last 3 months excellent presentations by some of the province's major generals. There's a lot of talent at Waghuis, but in terms of talent management, are they in the right positions? So is this issues that this task team is also going to look at? Because as a portfolio committee, we know there's people with excellent policing skills in Waghuis, but they're currently not deployed in crime-fighting capabilities. And for us as a committee, it's important that we've got the right people in that task team. Because if it's old wine in new bottles of wine, we're not going to have that effect. So maybe just your comments on that. Honourable Mulabatsi.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. We do need effective leadership in the South African Police Service in line with the NDP. But, Honourable Minister, in addressing this, will this include the removing of people in leadership who are ineffective? Or, without mentioning any names, you find a good general who excels in what he or she is doing is suddenly removed to a position where he doesn't add value. Will this also be considered? My next question is, when you speak of a panel of experts that will have international experts, will this not influence the end product to address more of international norms than local norms? Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Honourable Mulabatsi, for keeping to the 2 questions. Honourable Mula.
Thank you, Chairperson. My first question was covered by you on the leadership change. The next question, Minister, thank you for your presentation. Minister, in your implementation, I see you include reservists. Will they be remunerated if they are selected? Thank you.
Honorable Mabija.
Thank you, Chairperson, and thank you, Minister of Police. The report is so good, and I only hope that it will be properly implemented. But then I have this to ask. Whilst implementing the recommendations, how are you going to sift the members of SABC who form part of the crime activities from within SABC and outside SABC? For instance, the retired members, the fired members, and those who just decided to resign. Because we were given a report that they form part of a disturbing with a SABC redressing methods. And secondly, according to me, the way I perceive the mindset of some of the SABC members, they are still hooked in the apartheid training, such that even if we train or do whatever according to the recommendations, if the mindset is still like that, we are going to encounter a lot of challenges. Now, I don't know, is it possible to initiate a mental reconstruction development plan so that we can redress the mindset of those police members? Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Mabija. Honorable Robert Lekane.
No, thank you very much, Honorable Chair and Honorable Minister, and thank you for the presentation. I know the thankings and so on is not part of the two questions. It's just really the introduction to the subject. No, Chair, I want to start from the awkward situation, because then we don't see the minister, then we don't express this awkwardness. Minister, I think I just want to put this as a form of a little statement and then a question. When the Farlam Commission speaks about the culture and behavior, we need to say yes, we see that, because in a few weeks past we have experienced some of those in this room. We have experienced a strange culture in the 21 years since the 1994 democratic breakthrough of police management, top management, who came before this committee a number of occasions and demonstrated a foreign culture of behavior that really demonstrated that they are not answerable to Parliament, South African Parliament, in a form of this committee. Now, those are the top brass if you talk about the top structure of the police. I want to find out from you, and this has resulted in the Section 201 that Chair has been talking about. It hasn't happened before, it's going to happen now. Because of the police and the conduct and the behavior. How are we going to deal with this issue? Because when you deal with a number of issues, some of them are occupying positions that is strategic, that normally is going to require you to consider some of the task team and the task team work, which invariably has a tendency of confirming certain people in certain positions. How are you going to deal with that particular aspect? Which is related to that particular question is the issue of, I think the demonstration here, it actually demonstrated that the most important person will be in the eyes of every police officer that appeared here. Maybe not all, majority. The most important person would be a NASCOM, in a form whatever NASCOM would be, because that's a person who appoints them and fires them. Now, don't you think that in terms of the current protocols of appointment of the senior management, that you as an executive authority has got to play a role, given the constitutional requirement and responsibility, for the determination of those who would occupy the position, senior position? Of course, we don't debate because we know how the process of the national commissioners get appointed, but below, what you see, I'm sure sometimes you wake up the next morning and you just hear that there is a deputy national commissioner appointed without you knowing. So do you think that this particular matter requires more kind of faster movement than the process that is going to unfold in terms of your slides that you presented? This cascade, it's got a cascading effect. So those are and then the last second question, which is, I was asking the second one. The second one, Minister, is this. And I agree with this. I don't know, but don't you think that in South African context, that whilst you have the scale of the expertise in terms of the South African situation, that you do have a lot of them, that the scale of considering the international is going to have to be tilted a little bit in order that it comes out with a better perspective in terms of how do we then go about implementation. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for the 2.5 questions. Honourable Marke.
Thank you, Chairperson. Mine is sort of an overview question, if such a thing exists. I was looking at the duration, which runs up to 15 months, and looking at what exactly needs to be done. It's a total overhaul of, should I say, subs. Total overhaul. And then looking at the months, I was interested in the procedure that is going to be followed, especially with the panel of experts. We will have international experts involved. even if I don't know what my colleague was saying is the scale. So I was just interested, or from the panel, I had seen one slide there which shows that everything will from time to time go through the minister and back to minister, deputy minister, and back to, meaning that there will be some refining or what we might call a dialysis of whatever is being decided on. Then from there, because it's a presidential project, I would think maybe the recommendations from the panel will go to the minister, from the minister to the president, and in between there will be some refining. I wouldn't know from the president what is going to be involved there after that. But it involves a lot of things, meaning that the structure might have to be changed, legislation, which usually around here might take 3 years to change, even if it's prioritized. And when we talk about the culture to be changed, so I was just thinking, or then, where is the last point of refining every other thing? Because you'll be having an international expert from Britain who deals with bobbies who don't even have a weapon. Maybe they can't even shoot, who knows? And dealing with the South African situation whereby Tsotis raid a police station for weapons, then you can see that you need some refining there. Where is that done? So that we have an end product, and when the implementation starts, we are sure everything is intact. As I said, it's a very broad question. The legislation, everything, and in 15 months, I'm not very sure what will happen during that time. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you, Honourable Markie. Then we've got a new member from Agang. Welcome to the Police Committee. You're very much welcome. If you don't have a question, it's fine. But if you can just introduce yourself.
Before I can have a question. Thank you.
Who you are?
I'm Kwekwe Mahumapelo from Agang. I'm a brand new member here. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you.
Through you, Chairperson, Honorable Minister, I welcome the presentation. I've got only 2 questions. I don't want to make 2.5 questions, Chairperson. The first one from the slide that reads, transforming SAPS will be a monumental task and it needs outside approach. My question is that, what are the mechanisms that the Minister is going to use to accelerate this transformation from outside and inside? The second question is that it is based on the slide, resources versus service delivery. My question is that, is there no budget allocated for the resources to speed up their service delivery? Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you. You set a good example in your first meeting. Honourable Mhlongo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson, and thanks very much, Mr. Minister, for your presentation. Mine is too short. I think, Mr. Minister, from the presentations that have been made, as Chairperson has correctly outlined to this committee, it became clear that for Falam Commission's recommendations to be processed in the manner you have also figured them out or presented them out to us, with the current management, you cannot succeed, you cannot win. That's a cut and dry issue because of serious gaps in leadership, according to what we have seen. Now, is it not possible for you, Mr. Minister, then to divide this into two? The short term, that will talk to the total kind of reshuffling of senior management at a top command level, which will also, noting that that will go a long way in terms of them advising you as a responsible minister on key strategic issues that are in line with what my colleagues have actually said. Also feeding to the inputs that the panel of experts will be providing us with at that level of strategic assembling of this whole particular project. Then you focus then on the whole issue at hand, which is about the implementation. Then lastly, I think when I observed in your presentation, Mr. Minister, again as a responsible minister, to put the Commissioner General below the Deputy Minister in terms of line function of authority, I think it will have some kind of discords and time delays. Commissioner General accounts directly to you as a cabinet minister. The deputy minister is a non-cabinet person. So it's better maybe if you allocated the deputy commissioner general to that level. It will be better for you then to reconfigure that kind of, organogram, so that it actually quickens the process. Otherwise, you will be a loner as a responsible minister, and then there will be an administrative gap between yourself and the Commissioner General. And so I think you will need to work. It's a very, very small piece. Otherwise, your presentation was very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Honourable Mhlongo. Honourable Kola Barnard.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, could I ask that this presentation is circulated to us as soon as possible, please? Thank you. I must say, for the first time in my 9 years on this committee, I'm almost allowing myself to feel a modicum. I have to tell you, this is the first truly professional presentation that has come either from the ministry, from the SAPs, and I think it shows a move towards 21st century advanced policing that has been totally absent for forever. But I do agree with the Chair and his concerns that we may find people, you didn't quite go that far, but find people who, for example, were at Marikana and might have other issues there, serving on various of the panels. So I think that is perhaps an area of concern. I think that this team has to understand that we, and certainly our hopes have been dashed time and time again as fine plans have been presented, and then they fall short on implementation. So the skepticism will remain until one sees action happening. But first and foremost, I think we have to speak about the elephant in the room. Has the National Police Commissioner now been suspended pending the outcome of the investigation into her fitness? Because now I'm concerned we may have to wait up to 24 months to have some kind of outcome in terms of a determination on her fitness for being in the job, by which time I think her contract will probably have expired. But that could be a stumbling block to this entire process. I mean, we've seen the catastrophe of having Richard and Luli hang around year after year after year, raking in the millions and sitting at home. So I want an assurance in that regard. Certainly, we've seen presentations, but we've also experienced, and in fact, as many as 3 terms ago, we were already experiencing catastrophe in terms of e-dockets, which didn't happen, and then they were going to happen, and then an old man, whoever he was on it, and he didn't know anything about it, and all fell apart, and then they tried again, and the simplest part of the entire CJS integration construct failed. And so it's a great idea, but getting it off of this wonderful presentation and into the stations where, as you say, everyone questions, where are the people, where are the vehicles, but why are the vehicles sitting there? Oh, because they've got no driver's licenses. Oh, but hang on, who's got a firearm license? Because I gather we're now up to, what are we heading for, 35 odd thousand SABC members without a firearm license. Those are the issues that I'm sure they come under a line item in terms of training somewhere, but those are the ones that seize the minds of the civilians on the streets. So number one would be, yes, Police Commissioner, tell us what is happening there, please. And what assurances are we going to have in terms of implementation? Because, I mean, even years ago, we proposed, I think as a committee, before the current chair's time, rubber gloves should be in every operational vehicle so that members could administer first aid. It's never happened. At the Firearms Summit, proposal that a mini kit was put in every operational vehicle to ensure that the members did not contaminate crime scenes. Never happened. So we have lots of fine talk, zero implementation, and it is incredibly frustrating. Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Kolobana. Honourable Mbele.
Thank you, Chairperson, and thank you also to the Minister for the presentation. I'll echo Honourable Kolobana's sentiments about the quality and calibre of what we heard, and in particular for me it was encouraging to see that the presentation has identified points that I've been hammering about in the House, and I think the Minister will recall I've spoken about this disjuncture between the general resource allocation in the police service, but it doesn't seem to filter through on the ground. Certainly when the committee has done oversight visits at police stations and the nature of the complaints that we get from members of the public that I've summarized before as those 4 unders: understaffed, under-resourced, under-equipped and under-trained. And it's, as you said, the biggest growth has been in visible policing. And that needs to be investigated as to why we've had this massive increase in that bar graph of the allocation to visible policing, but it's not manifesting in tangible and visible terms, because I would suspect if we were getting a proportionate result with the allocation increase, the crime prevention impacts of the SABC would have been much more greatly felt by now. But that's not happening. So I think that's something that does need to be very closely looked at. But my second aspect is then my question. There were 2 curious and worrisome terms to my mind in the presentation that I need more clarity on, which is to ask the Minister what is meant by the terms integrating the SAPS and the Metro forces that was mentioned under the mission of integrating the security cluster, as well as the other term used of unification of police forces, because that would seem to contradict what was mentioned as being the modus operandi of let me just find this point here. Yes, about determining priorities by geographical area and differentiating policing action and resource deployment. So if it's speaking to an operational centralization, which might hamper the flexibility and the ability of policing action in different fields of government, then that's a contradiction that needs to be resolved. Certainly from the side of, I think, much of the committee, I could be mistaken, and in our engagements with the secretariats, there's been a fair amount of consensus that there's nothing wrong, for example, with the idea of having minimum national norms and standards insofar as they relate to SAPS and Metro Police, but a structural integration which removes the autonomy of Metro Police forces to perform their mandate in their sphere would be far from ideal, and in fact sets us back in terms of addressing crime. I'm going to stop there, Chair.
Thank you, Honourable Bailey. Honourable Groenewald.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, I want to start by saying that this presentation is quite disturbing for me, and I will tell you why. The submission we received this morning was actually giving us a picture of what is happening in the police services at this moment. You have a slide there, moments of truth. Now, if you look at the moments of truth on the slide, one would think that that is what is supposed to happen in any way. For instance, police officers on patrol treat members of the public and colleagues with respect and courtesy. Do not abuse powers or authority. Do we really still have this as a critical issue? And I think it is a sad day if a country must have an incident where a commission must be established to come forward with recommendations to actually say, but the top management of police services imploded and they did not ensure that we have a professional police services. And that is not fair towards those men and women in uniform who really do their utmost to ensure that we have a good police services. Because this is actually a remaking of the police services. But in the real truth, it is actually only trying to create the police services that was supposed to be there in the first instance. Because if we had professional, competent, senior management, then we wouldn't have needed a Farlam Commission. Then we wouldn't have had to implement certain recommendations. So it's actually an acknowledgement of the bad situation of top management in the South African police services. And yes, let's be honest towards each other. I hear some of my colleagues referring to the past. It was said in this committee that in 1995, the training of crowd control in the police services actually stopped. Only when we had the Tatani incident in Vicksburg, there was a wake-up call and said, yes, we had to look again at crowd control. As far as I'm concerned, Chairperson, we got into this situation because of the fact of political interference and the appointment and the political appointment of senior officers. we have a commissioner, national commissioner. She was appointed in June. 2 months later, we had the Marikana incident. She had no knowledge of police activities or the police services. In the Farnham Commission, we must have read that critical and crucial decisions was influenced by political views from the provincial commissioner from Northwest, as well as the National Commission. It's in the Farnham Commission. I think it's on page 515. So, the real problem, part of the whole problem is also the political interference and the political appointment of senior management of police. And that will have to be addressed drastically. Or else, I want to make the prediction that we're going to have the same situation. If we don't have competent people who are really experienced people in top management, we're not going to solve this problem. My questions, Chairperson. I know that the President will appoint the judge for a panel of experts. But do we have an indication? If I'm correct, the President must appoint the judge. Right. So the Minister can't really answer for the President. But do we have indication when this is going to happen? Because before the judge has not been appointed, nothing will actually happen. We have a good presentation here. But then they can only, and then also the appointment of the experts. It's not easy to get international experts. What time frame does the Minister envisage before both committees will be appointed? I will keep with one question. I think that is the most important. The others is actually what is going to happen anyway. Thank you.
So that was 2 questions and a speech.
Well, Chairperson, you said we can give our general impressions and then 2 questions. So I gave my general impressions and I only asked 1 question. I can ask more if you want.
Thank you for that. Thank you, honourable members, for your input. We appreciate. Honourable Minister, over to you. Thank you.
Oh, no, thank you very much. No, thank you very much. Thanks, honourable members. Firstly, there were constructive suggestions that were made by members in terms of what else needs to be looked into. So we'll take that into account moving forward. But there were also such questions that, in a sense, I'm beginning to probe certain corners of the mind in terms of what else needs to be looked into. Maybe let me start with the last question, which is a process question, really. We are currently, I am running one-on-one kind of engagements with at a local level with how do I call them? With people that potentially would form part of this particular panel across the spectrum, basically. As I had alluded to earlier on, the question of you have in this country, in academic institutions, for instance, you have people that you can actually tap into. You have people in non-governmental organizations that you can tap into, and so they can make a contribution in this exercise and so forth. But there's also an international angle that has got to be driven and so forth in terms of, asking and was scanning that environment quite carefully as well, in terms of which countries can effectively offer people that can make an effective contribution, for instance, on this international panel, on the panel of experts. Sorry. Now, so in a sense, that's what the process is. Insofar as I'm concerned, this is a very urgent matter, extremely so. I'm saying urgent. It's an urgent matter. The recommendations of the Judicial Commission of Inquiry, for an example, I don't think it's something that I can think about, oh yeah, no, even if I do it in 6 months' time or 12 months' time, it doesn't matter, 6 and 9. It can be. It's a very urgent matter because it's a matter that has engaged both the psyche and everything else of the South African society, for an example. So it's something that has got to be effectively sort of attended to. So that's one thing on the process side of things. Now, I hear the concerns of the chair and other members on the question of the change of leadership and so forth. It would be appreciated that because, and largely because, we did not do what was supposed to be done earlier on in our democracy, for an example. You then have this situation as we have it. You have a situation where I can't give you a direct response, for an example, as the minister of this portfolio, as to what is it that is going to happen and when. Precisely because legislatively it's crafted in such a manner that the issue has got to be decided somewhere else. So, seated here, I can't respond on behalf of the president, for an example, on this question. So that's one aspect. But I think the other aspect really, and some of the questions that have been raised, they pose one question. Between 1994 and now, did we transform the South African Police Service? I mean, did we really do that? And if we did, in what manner did we do it? Were we cosmetic about it, or were we quite fundamental about it? Did we address the issues of ethos, value, and outlook, for an example, in how this institution has got to police in the context of a democracy, and particularly constitutional democracy and so forth? Now, it's not a debate that I can provide an answer to. It's for all of us to engage with this question. So, Honorable Ramatlakane, when you raise this question that you just raised or posed, the South African Police Service is the only portfolio of government which every effort was made to define it outside of the body of public service. Every effort was made. And the ethos that informed that was what it used to be, essentially. You must remember that this thing was a law unto itself, this thing, before 1994. This thing was essentially that. It took deliberate sort of efforts and approach to establish itself as a military outlook in everything that he had to do. So all instruments were then designed in such a manner that it had to be that. And therefore, if you were to ask me, the fundamental mistake of a democracy is the failure to actually gravitate it effectively from where it used to be before 1994 into a constitutional order. The SAPS Act, the last time it was dealt with was 1995. A year later, in 1996, we adopted the Constitution. So the question is, are these two things aligned? You know what I'm talking about. Okay, so are these two things aligned? There we are, Act 1995, 1996 is the adoption. It was the 6th of May. Was it the 6th or the 8th of May, 1996, when we adopted the Constitution? And that's where your disjuncture, amongst other things, begin to arise, and so forth. I see also that even in recent times, in some of the legal challenges that one has had to deal with, this effort has continued. Even in the mind of people who decide cases, to think that the police service is an exclusive thing somewhere there that has got to be dealt with separately from the rest of the ethos of the public service. And yet we still continue to say it is an institution that has got to provide a service to the public. We say that when we talk. But when we begin to look at legal instruments, we do something else, which is the opposite. So these are some of the anomalies that I think both in our society and in our institutions of governance, we have got to address these issues. Because if we don't, we run a very serious risk, a very, very serious risk. The concern about, and then I think Honorable Molubatsi was the question about whether or not we'll remove people at leadership and so on. It's difficult to say at this stage because, I deliberately shy away from subjective approaches because we do not know what is it that we will find, for an example. But indeed, if you come across a situation where an engineer is a receptionist, there's something wrong with that. There's something very wrong with that. So this is an engineer, but he's a receptionist. He does the hello and everything else and message taking. So therefore, from a responsible management angle, it will be important to therefore deal with such a disjuncture and an anomaly of sorts. So I do not know what it is that we are likely to come across, for an example, when we begin to take stock of what exists and who's where, for what reason, and so forth. What I do know, though, is that within the South African Police Service, you have quite a crop of very good policemen and women, a very good crop of such people. And therefore, even the change management program that one is talking about, it's going to be quite critical that we also tap into that reservoir of knowledge, experience and expertise that resides within the police service. Those of you who did philosophy would know that there is a concept called negation of the negation, which essentially is about when driving a change management program, you take stock of what exists and what is it that can be used into the future, and what is still usable for the future, you log it onto the future, for an example, so that it is what would then assist driving you forward and stuff like that. So I just do think that it's going to be a critical exercise, that area, but it would also inform the kind of actions and steps that one would have to take. The question of the balance between, when we constitute a panel of experts, the international influence versus local and so forth. I know that I run the risk of sounding quite arrogant sometimes around this question, or around broadly about what I think South Africa is to the world, for an example. I think this country can teach many parts of the country, of the world, about its own experiences and educate the world about its own experiences and so forth. And therefore, in approaching this question, it's going to be important because the international angle is important insofar as tapping into the areas of best practice, for an example. Because indeed, out there in the world, there is that. And blending that with our own local kind of experience, for an example. And that approach for me is different from transposing, which is basically taking as is from whichever international experience and just, trying to do a direct sort of application of such onto the South African context and so forth. And that situation, and that approach shall never ever work, and so on. So it's important that for ourselves as South Africans, we may be good in whatever we think we're good in, but we should also know what are the current trends and what's happening out there in the world, and therefore how do we do a blending between the two. So that's why the composition for me is quite an interesting one, in the sense that we have, as I said, there are people that we can pull in from the local angle here in the country, who are quite knowledgeable, good researchers, good whatever, and everything else, but combine them with people who also have got an international sort of experience of sorts and expertise of sorts, to try and produce a dynamic sort of output in a way. So I think it's going to be a point taken that we should not. You should not have a balance that's tilted largely in favor of the international sort of experience, because South Africa is very unique. South Africa, just two things are very interesting. South Africa is probably the only country that I know, maybe members can also correct me, that, when people are in a public service, a delivery protest or something like that, they carry sticks, they carry whatever and so forth, and they behave in the manner in which they do, and so on, and demonstrate against the ANC government wearing ANC T-shirts and so on. It's a very unique kind of experience, really, in the world. And the question is, you can't deal with matters of this nature in isolation of your local experience, for an example. I don't know a country that experiences anything between 10 and 11,000 incidences a year of public protests. That's why I think this is one country that I know thus far. On the question of, we said something about reservists. I think it's a different matter, and the question of whether we'll remunerate or not remunerate. It's a matter that the issue of reservists is a matter that has got to be revisited in, broadly speaking, because I know that there are concerns and there are problems that have been expressed before. And a particular decision that was taken about the question of whether we remunerate or we don't, and so forth. It's a matter that has got to be looked into. But the point that we're making is that for a program of this nature to make sense and take, its rightful place and effect, you require mobilization of all structures that matter in our society and galvanize them towards this particular direction, for an example. And whether such structures participate in the panel of experts or don't, individual and as well as just local communities themselves, they must be activated towards a direction of this nature, for instance, because it is to the benefit of society as a whole to transform a South African police service and repositioning it towards the constitutional ethos, amongst other things, and so on. So that's just the general point I would want to make on that one. The question of the mindset You know, if I had a flip chart, I was going to draw out what generally runs out in my head, for instance, about, listen, that's any effective change management program has got to largely embrace three fundamental sort of elements. So there's a question of people and culture. That's your starting point, because any organization, its best resource, that's where it is located, your people. Eh? But what culture are they embracing, for an example, in the conduct of their day-to-day kind of work? That's one particular component. The other component, of course, is the question of business processes and so forth, which is more to do with institutional arrangements and so on, and so it goes. I think the third element is the question of your systems. What policies are you following? But what systems do you put in place to manage your processes and so forth, be it ICT, be it anything else and so on. So, in a way, those three components, it will then inform your change management program. If you do not, in fact, the other night I was thinking, if you were to draw out the three rings and then you take the Farnham Commission's recommendations, you would see, for instance, that some of the recommendations talk to people and culture. Some of the recommendations will fall under systems, and some of the recommendations will fall under business processes, for an example. Squarely in there, you can just simply slot them into those particular three categories. Now, and therefore, the question of the shift, mindset, and everything else is what, in my view, is ongoing, in a sense. It is something that it is worth essentially investing in, because unless you do that, you're just never going to win. You're just never going to be able to shift the institution from wherever it is to a different epoch altogether. So it's work that has got to be. It's work that has got to be to be factored in there. Now, the issue of duration, I think it was it Honourable Make. It's true that from a process point of view, I mean, it's a. Again, if I had a way of drawing this thing out, maybe I would have illustrated it. The starting point is the needs analysis and identification of what needs to be done. Okay? And this is where your panel of experts, for instance, they'll sit down, take the Farnham Commission recommendations, look at that, and the specific things that have been said there. But then deal with the question of what are the deliverables, for an example. What is it that would have to be achieved and so on. Design plans in terms of what steps would then need to be instituted going forward, and so it goes. Now, and it's true that what is then outlined is that you have your panels, you have your Minister of Police, you have the President, you have Cabinet, and so forth. But the fact of the matter is that there has got to be a feedback kind of process as well on an ongoing basis, which in itself would have to harbor the element of refining, for an example. So I don't foresee a situation where you develop something here and it just goes straight without any process of refinement, for instance, along the way, including, by the way, this very same presentation, that if we appear next time around the same issue, it would have to be a different sort of thing altogether, having taken into account what the comments are that have been made, but also what the other experiences are in terms of the one-on-one engagements that one is involved in. And so it goes and looking at whether or not one is making progress on this. So the question of refinement on an ongoing basis is going to be quite a central part of the work that that one has just spoken to. On the question of the, I think somebody raised something about budget allocation versus resources, for an example. It's something. I think we must have shown it in the slide, for instance, that there is also international benchmarking, and I think we spoke about Singapore. That 56% of their budget, of their police budget, is personnel costs. In our case, it's 74%, for an example. And that's a matter that has got to be zoomed into, because we think it also does have a direct sort of relation and impact on the question of the extent to which you can increase your level of rendering service and services, for instance, to communities and so on. So it's a I would say it's a specialized sort of branch of work that has got to be done from a financial management point of view, for an example. How do we begin to move ourselves towards the international sort of benchmark, for an example, around a matter of this nature? And particularly in the light of what I had alluded to earlier on, that in various community engagements, the issue of availability of resources and how service is being rendered to communities is a constant feature of complaints and grievances as you would find them in communities, for an example, with regards to issues of policing. So how do we begin to satisfy that particular concern from communities? And the starting point is identifying, of course, this anomaly between the question of resource allocation versus the question of delivery of services. In the last MINMEC, for an example, just an additional point, it's also a matter that was sharply raised by various MECs from provinces. The question of the need to review a resource allocation guide, and so on and so on, and looking at the overall deployment of resources. So it's a bigger point, and I think it is a burning point for policing.
Minister, sorry, we're going to just take a five minutes comfort tea break, and then we'll come back to the responses. And thank you very much. 5 minutes. Thank you, members. Right, thank you very much, honourable members. 1 minute that we can start. Right, thank you very much, members. We need to start. Members will remember that got some responses. Then we'll allow each member 1 question per member for the second round, because we need also to start with the civilian secretariat as well as rationalization. Right, thank you very much. Honourable Minister, you're welcome to continue with your responses, and then we will take each member, if they want to ask a question, 1 question per member. Thank you.
Okay. No, thank you very much, Honourable Chair, honourable members, and thanks for the comfort break. It was comforting indeed. Okay. No, there was a suggestion made by Honourable Nhleko about the need to divide the short-term issues and other issues, and perhaps the discontent that is also likely to arise between the issue of placing the Deputy Minister vis-à-vis the National Commissioner and so forth. I'll still have got to apply my regard to this question in terms of what exactly, but also even after this meeting, I may need to understand his reasoning, but it will be worth looking into. Of importance here, one of the failures in institutions anywhere in the world to be able to transform is when people decide to be positional, as opposed to, focusing on the stated objectives, for an example. Now, being positional, you always want to focus on what position you occupy and what sort of powers and delegated powers you have, and what does the law say and everything else, instead of saying what are the actual issues before you and how you need to address them, and therefore how do you use regulations, law, policy, and everything else as an instrument in dealing with the specific sort of issues before you and so forth. So that's just the general point around this thing. I would hope that when we constitute, for instance, panels and the task teams and so forth, we are not confronted with such a situation where people, instead of focusing on stated objectives, they largely focus on the positions that they hold and what they think of those positions that they hold, whether real or perceived. Now, Honorable Kola Barnard, now I'm getting it right this time around. Okay, yeah, never too old to learn. Yeah, thank you. Look, firstly, thanks for the comments you made, but I would really appeal that perhaps we need to step away from skepticism. I mean, the challenge is so huge. It's so huge to an extent that that it requires that we should try and be on the positive and the constructive side of things in order to be able to face up to the actual challenge of the day. Because we're not only just transforming the institution here, we're also doing that which essentially and eventually will yield a direct benefit to the South African citizenry. So that's just the point around this thing, and I'm just picking up on the issue of skepticism, because also, my experience does tell me that in issues such as change management, you are always confronted with these elements as well of skepticism and cynicism and whatever and so forth. And particularly if you were to develop a matrix on force field analysis and so on, you'll see these things, that you have sometimes a group dynamic that will fall within the cynical and the skeptic part of things and so forth. But you'll also have active role players and so on. But the important thing is to try and encourage everyone, internally and externally, to be on the side of being active role players in providing a contribution and a solution to the problem at hand, because this is largely a societal problem as we have it. I think the issue around resource allocation and service delivery is a matter that I had alluded to in terms of what exactly should be the ideal situation, and it would require that we embark on somewhat of a different approach to this question. The integrating SAPS Metro, I know that there's a constitutional debate, for an example, because in the Constitution there's the issue of a police service being understood as a single police service, for an example. I'm aware that in certain quarters there's these debates and so on, and it would be worth having that debate further, in fact. However, integration also is something that we may need to dissect a little bit further, because integration may not necessarily mean the same thing as a merger, for an example, but it may also talk to the issue of common systems, common platforms, and whatever, for coordination purposes and so forth. You remember that in the previous slide I spoke about the integration of the criminal justice cluster, for an example. By so saying, I was not saying that the police and prosecution, magistracy and or judiciary in broader terms were now going to be combined into one I was not meaning that. All I meant was the need to develop common systems and platforms for sharing, a common platform for sharing, basically. And that's where the issue of integration comes in. On the question of the moments of truth, it doesn't matter how you look at them. They still remain that. This is what needs to be done. And if it's done, we've got to intensify our this thing is like running. You'll probably know it because you once trained physically. That each training day is different. So if today your running rate or your pace was at 6 kilometers an hour, for an example, the following day you want to beat that record, until you get to a particular point where you yourself as an individual are quite satisfied that you are at your peak or so. Now, it does not mean that if you want to run at 12 kilometers an hour, for an example, it means you are not running. You may have been running, but running at 6 kilometers an hour, so you need to double up and so on and reach a particular point of satisfaction, for an example. So the moments of truth are also, in a sense, must also be understood in that particular sense. Political appointments. I don't know. Maybe it is something that, for instance, are political appointments political in the sense that they are appointments out of the ordinary? Or are they appointments in a sense that you need a character that has got to, in the conduct of his or her work, to align to? That must align to where the country is and where the country is going, for an example. And I think I'm much more in favor of that. Getting a Groenewald, getting an honorable Groenewald who's aligned to what South Africa is today and where South Africa is going. And I don't think it's something that we should be apologetic about that. For me, that's the important. That's the important point. And I disagree with the view that says because you would have been so appointed and therefore it means you are what? Ineffective, you are tardy, you are whatever. For me, those are two different sets of issues. I mean, if you are ineffective, you are ineffective, and we'll have to deal with that. If you are inefficient, you are inefficient, we'll have got to deal with that. And that has got nothing to do with your nature and form of appointment, for an example. You may perhaps know this thing. I've been in different functions around government. But you have never come across a situation where somebody will tell you that because I happened to have been a political appointment somewhere, in one particular area of administration, I was inefficient, I was whatever and so on. You have not come across something like that. Now, and of course I know that the danger is again sounding arrogant about this thing, but I'm trying to draw the line between your conduct on a day-to-day basis in terms of the work that you need to do and the question of how correctly aligned you should be to where the agenda of the country is and where it is going, and the nature and form of your appointment. So this notion that says if you have had political appointments, they necessarily equal inefficiency. I disagree with that thing. Unless, of course, it's being proven that whomever is making such appointments have a sole intent of ensuring that an institution fails. And I don't think it's in the best interest of anybody to have a failing institution. for that matter, and so on. So I think we should draw the line in between the two. However, the valid part of your argument is such that, and I think nobody can disagree with this. Even if you have a political appointment, we must ensure that that political appointment that political appointment does not necessarily translate into inefficiency and so forth. And the fact of the matter is that you are saying we need effective and efficient and best performing managers. And I think that is a matter of principle. We shall all embrace that thing, and nobody can be in disagreement with that particular point. So I would like to then end it here, Honourable Chair, in terms of just the questions, and again thank honourable members for such a kind of an engagement and the constructive sort of points that were and suggestions that were made in regard to a task of this nature. I do think that I do think that we'll certainly succeed. All we need is to mobilize all that needs to be mobilized, including the manner in which we focus and cite ourselves towards this fundamental task. Thank you very much.
Right, honourable members, we'll go to the second round. One question per member. We start with Honourable Groenewald. No speeches.
Thank you, Chair. Short question, but will the Honourable Minister not agree with me that when it comes to the operational functions of the police services, that should be a person that's not supposed to be a political appointment? The Minister is the political appointment. And I've checked his history. He doesn't have to worry about it. He did a good job up till now. We will see how the future goes. But what I say, in short, one question, will he not agree when it comes, because someone made a remark to say that, but if you're a manager of Checkers, for instance, you can be a commissioner of police. Wow. Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Groenewald. Honourable Mbele.
Thank you, Chairperson. My one question to the Minister is going to be slightly at a tangent, but still relevant if the Chairperson will indulge me. While we're on the topic of commissions into policing, can I ask the Minister if, and because it is quite gratifying to see the seriousness with which the Farlam Commission findings and recommendations are being taken by the Ministry, but can I ask if the Minister will give the same consideration, the same urgency, and the same focus and attention to the findings and recommendations from the Khayelitsha Commission reports? Because unfortunately we've seen delays on that side, and the issues that it addresses are also very serious insofar as police service delivery for the communities of those three policing sectors the three police stations in Khayelitsha are concerned. Last I heard, there's been agreement on the joint task team to look into the Commission's reports, but it has seemed from media reports that SABC has been stalling in this regard. So can I ask if there is that same seriousness and focus and commitment from the Minister to drive through the implementation of the recommendations from the Khayelitsha Commission? Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Mbele. Honourable Kola-Barnard.
Thank you, Chair. Through you, Chair, to the Minister, there doesn't seem to be any reference to police criminality and brutality. Certainly that's all the nice touchy-feely stuff there, but, there are, as far as we know, 1,448 convicted criminals in the SAPS. The current National Police Commissioner has failed to rid the SAPs of even one of them. And it was detailed to us, they are rapists, bigamists, fraudsters, they've used their weapons to hijack people, and they've all been promoted. One is as high as Brigadier General. And the list of crimes, it was like 2 pages long. And they've apparently committed at least 2 each. So that is a concern, but I'm a bit worried because that's an operational matter, and I'm now talking to the Minister, and that's something that should have been dealt with by the National Police Commissioner. But as you've running this with us, I mean, in the operational milieu, it concerns things like the use of the R5s. Now, I know it will be looked at in terms of this whole process, but surely there's going to be a step taken today that says do not use them until it is determined whether or not, because there's a huge outcry. I mean, they are weapons that are intended to kill en masse. And that's what was used and what is still in use. And those kinds of issues I'm hoping will come out here, as well as whether or not, and I was very impressed that you knew about the cameras. I mean, I think everyone every operational member should have a camera on their bulletproof and in their car. And then if someone's going to attack them, we will see film footage of it, and if they attack someone, we will have that on film, because that's the only time it ever comes out. So I wish it had not just been mentioned as an aside by the Minister, but was in here as a way forward, because I think that would go a very far way to solving those problems. And of course, the technology that would allow us to determine who fires a rubber bullet, because of course the people who shot and killed Andries Titane all got away because no one could determine which of them fired that rubber bullet, because of course there's no way to date, as far as I know, to determine that. But if that can be part of the investigations, I would be most grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Member. Honourable Mhlongo.
Thank you very much. I'm not going to make a speech. But I think the Minister, I fully agree with him on the question of, this notion that on the notion of international practice, but not necessarily going for wholesale. I'm sure the experience in France, you have seen it. In France, police, when were confronted with what happened there, they were found with their pants down because they considered themselves to be living in a small heaven. Now, I agree entirely there. But with our case, it will be important to note, those who did philosophy will understand that colonies, 2 forms of colonies, settler colonies and colonies of occupation, have got different patterns of crime altogether. Settler colonies being very violent, opposed to colonies of occupation. So then, should policing be outside of those rails, you miss the point. But I want you, Mr. Minister, I request you, Mr. Minister, to answer the point that I raised earlier on. Without being diplomatic, I know you can be diplomatic. The mission that Falam is pointing us to embark on, in my own assessment and also the assessment of this committee, is very clear that at your top echelons of command, serious strategic weaknesses in terms of leadership exist. And you cannot win. And the country cannot win. Do you have short-term measures to ensure that before you embark on this, we can actually execute this? Because if not, we are going to go back to same square one, people protecting their positions, ridding off good men and women from actually taking a lead and using every measure to frustrate them. I am saying that because I've seen it here, even when they were presenting issues before us here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Honourable Member. Honourable Marke, you fine? Honourable Ramatlakane.
No, thank you, Honourable Chair. The The issue, Minister, in terms of the transformation and many other things, one of the things that the committee has been talking to the management has been this issue of at the various intervals, the top structure changes based on who's the national commissioner. In other words, this national commissioner comes in, he changed that structure, he installed another structure, you end up with a top-heavy management structure. Now, the question I was asking you earlier on around this issue about police, not necessarily the appointment procedures. Now, I don't quite understand it. The whole thing about where is the authority of that modus operandi? Is it, because some will say it's a national orders, standing orders that empowers the national commissioner to do this. I will say, but this is a cabinet, it was a devolved functions from cabinet. But if it's either of the two, the executive authority still has a responsibility to arrest that situation. So I just want to understand how you're going to deal with that particular aspect. Because I think if it's not addressed, it will continue to be a problem. That is going to be a kind of snowballing problem that we see currently. Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Member. Honourable Mabija.
Thank you, Chairperson. It's not a question, it's a comment. I feel very much relieved, and I can say I feel proud because the understanding of today's ministerial presentation, all the political parties gave me an understanding that they are happy about the presentation, meaning that they say it's a good presentation. And then I do not wish to see some honorables going out to the media with a different negative connotation of today's presentation, because now it means we are moving South Africa forward, police-wise. Thank you.
Honourable Mabija.
Thank you, Chairperson. Honourable Minister, in your 4 key points, you have repressing crime as point number 2. How do you see this working in our courts, where people are given bails and they disappear unreleased after they were arrested by the police? Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Malabatsi. You're the last. Oh, no, sorry, I forgot about you.
Person, mine is not in this report, but it has to do with it. When everything is said and done, at the end, there are orphans and widows of this tragedy. Will they be compensated? Thanks, Chair.
Honourable Member, you're the last, indeed.
Thanks, Chair. I have got one question. My question relates to the accessibility of cell phones by prisoners. To say, is there no means or ways for intensification of the security check? Because I'm just surprised to say, how do they access those things? And even the signals inside the prison, to say, how do they access the signal? Maybe it is a question of bringing back the signal, I'm not sure, but if
if that is not if that is not the issue, I think the question of signal will have to be checked. Thanks, Chairperson.
Thank you very much. I think maybe the last observation from my side, I think a lot of the recommendations indicated by the Minister is also linked to the white paper. Maybe just to get the indication from the Minister, what will also be the role of the Secretariat, the Civilian Secretariat, in driving this process in terms of police reform to ensure that we reach the targets, and then what is the commencement date of this task team that's going to be chaired by the Deputy Minister? Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Chairperson, and thanks, honourable members. Let me start with the chair. Honourable Cronenberg will be the last person to respond to. Not because I don't like him, but as my friend. No, Honourable Chair, on the question of, I agree, most of the issues, they also have got something to do with the white paper, correctly so. The Secretariat is part of the panel, particularly the task team. So it would have to play quite a critical role there, insofar as the whole matter is concerned. And in fact, there is an outstanding, not necessarily outstanding, it's just that Mr. Rapia here, the acting secretary, started yesterday. I still owe him a discussion on exactly this particular point in terms of the role that they have got to play in the process. The question of the cell phones in prisons and so on, I think it's a matter that requires quite a comprehensive discussion at a broader cluster level, really, about that. I know that correctional services for quite some years has been battling with this issue. They get smuggled, basically, into prison facilities, and smuggling takes place in different sort of forms. So it's a matter that requires alternative sort of measures. Maybe one of them, which I don't know how expensive it will be, is a question of signal jamming. I don't know, and what are the implications for that? It's just probably one of those things, but it's a matter that requires further sort of engagement. On the question raised by Honourable Levatsi on compensation of victims, I'm taking a briefing today from our legal team from SABC on the question of the approach on this question. But however, let me just say this, and I'm not addressing myself to the issue of compensation. The fact of the matter remains that what we need in South Africa is essentially a closure on this question pertaining to the Marikana tragedy. We need, because the blame game is not it doesn't benefit anybody. It just simply doesn't benefit anybody. Because right now, that's the platform that is there. You did this is what, and so on and so on. But that is not going to help. The fact of the matter is that we need to reconcile and stabilize our people in that community. We need to find a better way also of going over this particular situation, taking all sorts of sensitivities into account and stuff. So, unfortunately, I'm unable to respond to your question about whether there will be compensation or not at this stage, because the matter papers have been filed, for an example, in court and so forth. So we need further engagement on the issue. we need further engagement on the issue. Now, the question of the need to repress crime and investigate crime is a need. It's an ever-present kind of need. It's there, so it has got to be done. However, one of the weaknesses that we are also beginning to say, let's put our heads together at a criminal justice cluster level, is the whole question of how do we coordinate around cases, for an example, in such a manner that, because, you know, for instance, 2 weeks, is it 2 weeks or a week ago, I was part of an Imbizo, a Nyanga, for an example. This issue also came up. So wherever you go, in other words, communities acknowledging that police do their work, but then people get released in courts and so forth. But also when you talk to prosecutors turn the other way around and say, yeah, but it's police that are not effective in investigating cases and so on, and therefore we can't prosecute successfully and so on. So it's a matter that has got to be somewhat addressed. What I don't agree with, I mean, here in Wynberg, in Cape Town, just an example, some time ago, I think I had just started in this portfolio, there was a case of a young child that was raped by her uncle. And the magistrate decided to throw the case out because there were technical challenges from an investigation point of view. And the question that I raised was, if you have loopholes, identify the loopholes as the investigating officer to deal with those particular loopholes and then bring the case back. Because basically you then had a child who perpetually was a victim, and not receiving justice. And yet you know why that child was not receiving justice is because of the technical loopholes in the investigation stage or something like that. And there's nothing in law that prevents anybody, as a presiding officer, by the way, to then say, look, here are the loopholes, and I'm not going to hear this matter here and now. Go back and fix these particular loopholes and then bring the matter back. You know? So I'm saying there's also something that needs to be dealt with at that particular level in terms of the coordination work between ourselves, policing, prosecution, and the subsequent point, which is the incarceration. Now, that's the one thing. Now, the question of structure changes. You know, it can never be, and this is what I tend to generally discourage most people in institutions, wherever I've worked before. The starting point is not necessarily, you know, this thing of, yeah, now we had a new commissioner or a new something in a place and therefore change the structure. Necessarily, it does not necessarily always translate into better results and better performance of an organization. So you need to have a comprehensive kind of, you know, a view and approach to issues of structure, because the interlinkage between structure and delivery is fundamental. So in other words, the extent to which you deliver on your stated objectives as an institution is largely informed by your structure and so on. So, it shouldn't be so much of a point of emphasis per se. I think the question is, how do you strike the balance between that which you should basically deliver and achieve as an organization versus how you are structured, in other words, the vehicle that and mechanisms that take you to your end results and so forth. So that's the that's the thing around the issue here about that particular point. But where it is necessary to factor changes, yes, you do, but factor that from a responsibility point of view. In other words, you factor that in such a manner that your your structural changes, they actually do reinforcing and consolidation of your institutional work. It becomes quite a useful thing. And you know very well that in what I'm telling you now, you agree with me, but I'm staying away deliberately from something else that you know. But those are the surrounding principles around this thing. Honorable Kolabana, on the question of police criminality and brutality, whether it should be factored in there. Look, you remember that I said one of the critical sort of pillars of a change management program is the question of people and culture. Now, so when you deal with issues of people and culture, you have got to interrogate the question of how do people do their work and what ethos do they follow in executing their work on a day-to-day basis. What shortcomings are there, for an example? And therefore, the questions such as, a question of, criminality, brutality, and all other ills that are there will also be identified. And the question would be, now that you would have identified those, what are you doing with such shortcomings and weaknesses in the organization? But also importantly, how do you prevent the recurrence of issues of criminality and police brutality, for instance, within an institution? How do you ensure that in the future you minimize risk? You manage that as an isolated sort of risk in such a manner that if in the past you were attracting 10 criminals into your establishment, how do you down manage that maybe to 2, maybe, or 0, things like that at best. So I'm just saying it would form part of this issue. It will definitely emerge out of people and culture component of the change management program thing. On Khayelitsha now, the interesting dynamic about Khayelitsha is that if you look at the issues raised in that report, are the same issues that you'll find people complaining about in Seshego, are the same issues that you'll also find people complaining about in Vryburg or Mangaung or Mahlabatini somewhere. So, and therefore the critical question is, how do we deal with these issues? Not only just simply isolated to Khayelitsha, but basically right across. And the issues, you remember that in the presentation that I had spoken about, or let's say in the earlier interaction, I also referred to the issue of a resource allocation guide as a matter that was also raised by MECs right across provinces as something that needs to be reviewed, for instance, amongst others, to ensure that we have improved levels of service delivery insofar as policing is concerned, and so it goes. And that question is a similar question that you'll find that it was also raised insofar as the Khayelitsha report. But moving forward, there is no way that you will deal with the Falam recommendations and the change management program and plan that one is working on and not take into account all the issues that are raised either in the Khayelitsha Commission report or are raised in community engagements in Vryburg or raised in community engagements in the Mahlabatini, for an example. So all of them, they would have to be taken into account, because the issue here is how do we improve services? from a policing point of view. How do we do that? And but also importantly, is not just the how, but how do we also begin to reprioritize the resources in such a manner that we put so much of an emphasis from where it actually matters the most, and that's at a ground level and so on and so on. So these are the critical issues that you cannot just simply escape when you have got to deal with a matter of this particular nature and so on. So that's the one part around that. Honorable Groenewald raises the matter about operations and whether or not, and I think you're still pursuing your debate or the issue about political appointments, the appointment of a national commissioner as opposed to having a professional police, a person to whatever. And I think it's in the context of that you're raising this thing. And I think I must have said this thing to you before, that I've had people debating this issue. And I think when the issue is being debated, there is less objectivity in it. That's my problem about it and so on. Now, and I must be careful in terms of what I eventually say. For an example, and I said this thing earlier on in this very same session, that you need to draw the line between what it is the attributes of a person, in other words, your levels of competency and everything else and so on, and draw that away from form and character of appointment. Because what you have done, both in your mind but also in further engagements, even in this committee, is to conflate the two. To you, form and character of appointment determines the level of skill, determines the level of competency and, everything else. And I don't agree necessarily with that approach. Now, if you're a national commissioner, for an example, that's a strategic management position. And essentially it is also a function different from being a station commander or managing, a precinct, or not just precinct, but both precinct and jurisdiction, or within a particular police station and so forth. And there, you are much more at the coalface of operations. Okay? So. At the same time, of course, you do need, and this is where the balance has got to come in, you do need to have strategic management expertise, skilling, and whatever. You do need to have that. But perhaps there is also validity in the point that says have some degree of of exposure, understanding at a basic level, of course, around issues of generally speaking, the security cluster and so forth. I think there is probably also validity on that particular point. But I would argue that perhaps the weakness in the debate is that we have taken an either-or kind of approach. In your mind, for instance, you think that you need to have a professional police person to be a national commissioner. In some others, they would say, no, that's absolutely not a necessity and so on. But there is also another angle that we can also look into. How do you balance between the two, in a sense, in determining a leadership level, for an example, or the character of a person that must occupy a leadership thing and so on. But I think it's part of an intricate kind of a debate which is ongoing on issues of this nature. Because remember that if you are at that level, you are also responsible for directing work of policing and the functioning of policing within a constitutional context. What does that mean? It means you must also have a broader understanding of what this society is, what this society thinks, and how this society moves, and so on. So you also must have that as a factor that governs, I suppose, your work as a commissioner. Of course, I've never been a commissioner before at this level, so this is what I think, though, are the necessary sort of balances that you must be factored in that. Thank you very much, Chairperson, and thanks very much, honourable members.
Thank you very much, Minister. I presume the starting date of the task team is quite soon. The answer on that. Am I correct?
No, pretty soon. I'm sorry, Chair, I didn't respond to that. Pretty soon we have got to do it. It has got to be done. What is difficult to govern are our interactions with identified people that have got to constitute the panel. So I'm right in the middle of these engagements, the one-on-one in that particular process and so on. Of course, the one outstanding sort of leg is the international leg, which I'm trying to push very hard to also begin to engage with the relevant countries and bodies in the world that can really assist us in regard to this. Yeah, thanks, Chair. I'm being reminded that Honourable Nhleko raised that point, and I responded to the issue before you came in. And all I was saying, the long and short of it really, is that it is a matter that would require thinking on my part. And I welcome that suggestion to then say, look, these are some of the issues that I may have got to look into. So I agree with you insofar as saying, look, these are the issues that you should also take into account in further sort of sharpening this area of work. So I accept that, and thanks very much for raising those points. It's just that at the time when I initially responded to the issue, you were not in, so you walked in right at the tail end for that. Apologies for that. Thank you very much, Chair.
Right, thank you very much to the Minister of Police for presenting recommendations and the action plan with regarding to the Farm Commission. I presume we will get an update as we go along in the next term, and I think we will also have to schedule maybe a briefing by IPID on their steps they are taking, as the Minister indicated. And I think we've already indicated that we welcome this project and we will monitor it closely. Thank you.
I wonder why we have the Minister here. I did check with the Secretariat. They did not know when the release of the crime statistics is.
Yeah, that's a matter we can take up with the police management, and we'll take that up with them. So thank you very much. We'll give a 2-minute break because I think the Minister's got a press engagement in the Mbizo Centre. So we'll give 2 minutes then for the Secretariat to take their seats, and then we'll go with the Quarter 4 and Quarter 1 reporting. Thank you.